Welcome to the museum. It's awesome to be able to give a talk here in my house. Michael John gave you a fantastic sneak preview of some of the exciting things we're doing in the museum, but we also have an amazing collection. And in fact, there's about 1.5 million objects in our collection, which makes it one of the largest museum collections, not only in Boston, but in the world. So today I have one object outside the glass. I'm deputizing all of you to be honorary curators because how many of you have heard a talk today and think, they should do a museum exhibit about that, or maybe they should have something in the collection? Anyone think we've got some candidates for museum exhibits? Well, great. We're going to start with a little clip that I'm guessing many of you are familiar with. And I'm going to see if I can activate the sound here.
9, 8, 7, RS-25 engines.
Okay, join in.
4,
3,
1,
2.
booster ignition, and liftoff.
Great. Well, how many of you watched that just 10 days ago? Pretty darn exciting to see the countdown and liftoff of Artemis II. And in fact, John mentioned my background is as a historian of aerospace history and technology. Prior to coming to MIT, I was a historian at NASA. Even before that, I worked for the National Air and Space Museum. So I really love space. I was one of those kids who wrote to NASA to get the free press kits to have the pictures hung up in their, bedrooms. We played in second grade, we played Apollo. And everybody, they had these big boulders, and they were all the stages for the Saturn V rockets. And we fought over who was going to be Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, or Michael Collins was kind of left out in the field. Any case, what I have been thinking about space is not just because Artemis has been in the news lately, but in fact, last month marked the 100th anniversary of the first successful liquid-fueled rocket. That took place on March 16th, 1926 in Auburn, Mass. That's about 40 miles from here. And that impressive structure flew 2.5 seconds, so less than the countdown that you just watched, and it rose about 41 feet. But it proved this liquid fuel rocket concept worked. And in fact, this is the basic design of rockets that we still use today. So I was thinking about, how do we honor Goddard? We've got this new space thing. We have the theme of time going on in the museum. And so I titled this talk Musings, because I'm going to take you on a journey. And the first thing I want to start with is give you a little background about Goddard himself. He was born in 1882 in Worcester, and his early youth was in Boston. He moved back to Worcester in 1898. His mother was very sick with tuberculosis. He had a younger brother who died just before the age of 1, and so he had this overprotective grandmother in Worcester who, anytime he had a cold or the sniffles, would keep him out of school. And so he gets to high school, and he's actually 2 years behind. He graduates. He could vote when he graduated from high school in Worcester. But he had a childhood that I suspect many people in this room would identify with. He was a science nerd. He had a microscope and a telescope. He convinced his father to get him a subscription to Scientific American, which you can see picture of one of the covers from that time period. And it was just filled with news about trains and bridges and dams and cars and even lighter than air vehicles. And so it was very inspirational to him. So when he graduated, or I would say when he got to Worcester, about a year later, he had an unusual experience. And that experience he talked about. He was the graduation speaker for his high school class in Worcester in Mechanics Hall. And he gave this account, which he wrote down later on, but he was very specific. October 19th, 1899, I climbed a tall cherry tree at the back of the barn, and he's trimming dead limbs off of the tree. And he says, I imagined how wonderful it would be to make some device which had even the possibility of ascending to Mars. And you're like, what? Where did that come from? Well, the year before was the publication of this book, The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. Now that book, the book was published in 1898, but it actually was serialized in newspapers the year before. And depending on where you lived, that story got modified. So he got the Boston Post version, which had the invasion taking place in Lexington and Concord. But if you lived in New Jersey and New York, it took place in New Jersey, northern New Jersey. And if you lived further out, if you lived in another place, you had this slight tweaks and variations in the story. This book, of course, would become super famous when it was made into a radio show many years later that was so realistic that people actually thought we were being invaded by Martians. But this is the source of Wells's ideas about Mars and of space travel. It really captured his imagination. And so when he gave his commencement address, this has to be one of the most famous high school commencement addresses because it gets quoted all the time, especially at the end. And he says here, just as in the sciences we've learned that we are too ignorant to safely pronounce anything impossible, so for the individual, since we cannot know what his limitations, we can hardly say with certainty that anything is necessarily within or beyond his grasp. Each must remember that no one can predict what heights of wealth, fame, or usefulness he may rise until he has honestly endeavored. And he should derive courage from the fact that all sciences have been at some time in the same condition as he, and that is that it is often proved true that the dream of yesterday is the hope of today and the reality of tomorrow. And I think you would agree that all of the speeches we hear today have that theme, that sequence, that vision and then the dream and then the hope and the hard work, and hopefully brings that to becoming a reality. He goes from high school to Worcester Polytech, where he earns a bachelor's degree, and then he goes to Clark University, also in Worcester, where he earns a master's. And by 1911, he has earned a PhD, so sort of made up for the lost time in high school being kept home by his grandmother. And at that point, he was fully committed to the idea of space travel. And he had started a series of experiments with, could you travel in a vacuum, for example? That was an idea that people thought wasn't possible. And he proved that experimentally. And that was so promising that the Smithsonian Institution gave him a small grant of money such that in 1919, this pamphlet was published called A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitudes. It's really kind of the starting gun for rocketry. It would be read by scientists in Germany who later on in World War II told Americans, where did they get the idea for their V-2 bombs? They said, oh, well, from your American. We read all his research papers. Normally, these publications attracted no attention. But this idea of space travel, of rocketry, was so revolutionary that, in fact, it got all kinds of attention from newspapers. And this article that you see here from the New York Times is captioned, "A Severe Strain on Credulity." It just said, this is crazy. This is nonsense. This guy is a fake, a charlatan. And he tried valiantly. This is like the scientists today who try valiantly to speak out against, this assault of trolls and social media that tell them, no, your thing is wrong, it's not like this. And so he tried to correct the record, but eventually it was exhausting, and it basically made him quite reclusive. One of his biggest fans was Charles Lindbergh, and Lindbergh arranged funding, and he went out to Roswell, New Mexico. You ever wonder why Area 51 and Martians and so forth and extraterrestrial stuff comes out of Roswell? Well, there was this crazy reclusive guy who made the handful of workers with him sign agreements that they could never talk about what they were doing. They couldn't reveal any experiments. He was so sort of snake-bitten by this early media experience that he didn't want any part of it. So he continues these experiments. I should note that the New York Times did retract its statement on July 17th, 1969, the day after the Apollo 11 flight launched. With this, I quote, "Further investigation and experimentation have confirmed the findings of Isaac Newton, and it is now definitively established that a rocket can function in a vacuum as well as in the atmosphere. The Times regrets the error." So we're coming to this countdown theme. In Germany, there's a young Romanian studying at the University of Heidelberg. And in 1922, he presented a dissertation on rocketry, and he failed. People said, this isn't possible. He got the book published a year later in 1923, and it became very influential in German-speaking circles. This fold-out is one of the diagrams inside his book. But it also inspired science fiction writers. And so there was a book written by Thea von Harbou, and she writes this novel called Frau im Mond, or The Woman in the Moon. Now, von Harbou was married to the German filmmaker Fritz Lang, and she had collaborated with him the year before in 1927 on the silent film classic Metropolis. So it was no surprise they decided they were going to make a film about her book. And it's called Frau im Mond, as you can see from the poster. And it's in this movie that the countdown originates. And so you can see it goes through, you can watch this online, and it's silent, and unless you get one with the music version, but it says, 10 seconds, and then 5, and then 4, and then 1, and instead of liftoff, it's jetzt. And inside, this is the astronaut, well attired. David Newman might have something to say about his setup. But it launches off, and ever since, we have had this phenomena of countdowns in popular culture. So whether it's New Year's Eve, and or space launches such as the Artemis II. Now, if you watched the splashdown last night of Artemis II, you know that for the past 10 days, every minute was scheduled. There's a really elaborate flight plan. In fact, every space mission, whether it's a satellite launch or a manned mission, every single second is accounted for. And on the right is the diagram, overview timeline for Artemis. On the left is the cover from the Apollo 11 flight plan, which is a book like this thick to cover every single second and minute in that mission. It tends to make us think that this is a straightforward sequence of actions, that apart from this weirdness of the starts and restarts of countdowns, where if you ever watch this and they notice and they're like, oh, we're going back to T-minus 3 minutes and counting. The flight plan is structured according to modern notions of linear time. But one of the things that I noticed in our collection is, and I have a printout here which you can come and look at later on, and you can see another one in the gallery, is this printout contains all of the programs for the Apollo guidance computer. And the computer, as you can see from this graphic, is at the center of governing all the activities. When John F. Kennedy said, we choose to send a man to the moon before this decade is out and return him safely to Earth, that task was accomplished by engineers and programmers here at the MIT Instrumentation Laboratory, now known as the Draper Laboratory. And at first they thought the astronaut could control the whole thing, but as you noticed, it takes a long time to get to the moon. That's a really long time to be paying attention every single second, watching all the gauges. And they realized that having a machine assist, a computer assist, would be essential to the success of this particular mission. So this program is for the Lunar Excursion Module. The one upstairs in our gallery is for the Command Module. And to make these programs work, that's the computer. It's about a cubic foot and a half. Most of you have watches that have more computing power. Forget your phones than this computer. So to accomplish sending a spaceship to the moon and back with such a small computer by today's standards, you have to really think very cleverly. And the cleverness was really governed by a concept for the architecture of how the Apollo guidance would work by this guy, Hal Lanning. And Lanning said, well, the computer has to work in real time because you can't wait for 2 hours for it to calculate something. But we can't work like other computers, which is you got to do the whole task and then you do the next task, you do the next task. That was pretty common. We don't have enough time, can't function in real time. So they invented this concept they called interrupt-driven software. The way in which you could stop and start. So every piece, every program in here had a time assigned to it. And that sequencing was assigned. You got your X number of milliseconds, and then the next program started. But they said, oh, it's not enough to just make people follow these time sequences. We have to be able to override it. And so we have priority scheduling of things. This task is more important than that task. Doesn't matter. It has to happen now. That's a really interesting, innovative idea in the history of computing. And that function means you have to have a great clock. Now, you don't need to know time in the way we keep time. It's, well, this timer says I'm way overdue to stop. Really, I'll stop really soon, but it's telling you when all these functions occur. So there's little crystal oscillators that send out electrical pulses, and those pulses design or drive timing registers and counters. These are programs called, clever names, time 1, time 2, time 3, time 4, time up through time 6. And they're embedded in all of these programs that are running, that are keeping track of how long your program is. And then they have an exciting program called Waitlist that allows you to request that your program be allowed to run after a delay. And so these techniques, this way of manipulating time, of cutting it off, adding, subtracting, was a really crucial innovation that made spaceflight possible. So from countdown to splashdown, that's a picture from last evening. The picture on the right is one of Goddard's missiles coming back down to Earth. It didn't have a parachute yet. I think it's useful. I've discovered that time is a really useful tool to think about complex systems and technological change. And a simple question about the origins of the countdown kind of led me on this weird pathway. I've got German science fiction writers and H.G. Wells and cherry trees being chopped down and reclusive scientists and all of these characters in here. And it made me also realize that I've been biased all this years by this notion of linear time, that time only moves in one direction, time's arrow. And so there's an American historian, John Demos, who wrote this wonderful series of lectures called Circles and Lines. And he reminds us that time can be linear, but it can also be circular. And he concluded these very erudite lectures that he gave at Harvard University with a very personal reflection. And he says, well, think about sports. And he said, the game of baseball, the object is to circle the base paths and get home. And he said, but think about football. That is to march down a very long field and put the ball in the end zone. And he said, we live in this world that has both circles and lines. And I think in terms of the history of spacecraft and space timing and looking at these programs, I've realized that we think about the mission in a linear fashion, but it wouldn't be possible if the computer programmers didn't think in circles. Thank you.